Okay, good afternoon. I'm Mr Craven from the NET English Strengths team, and today I'm going to be talking through Seamus Heaney's poem Storm on the Island. So let's start with Seamus Heaney. Now, he's probably the most famous Irish poet of the late 20th century. Now, he was born in 1939 to a farming family. He was one of 9 children, and he grew up in the countryside, which is something that does influence his understanding of the natural world, and also I think his depictions of how people exist within it and how they relate to it. Now, he studied at university in Belfast, and he went into teaching and lecturing, which is something he did continue, I think, throughout the remainder of his career, on and off. Now, he has written in other genres, but poetry has been very much Heaney's main form of creative output. And in a lot of his works, he explores the relationships between people and within communities, and situating those people within their natural and their socio-political settings. But he also looks quite often at the richness and the importance of language and culture, including the influence those can have on individuals. It's partly as a result of all of this, of course, that he was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1995. Now, the Northern Ireland in which Heaney grew up was continuously unsettled by periods of sectarian unrest, which included rioting in Belfast in the 1950s. Now, several of the key paramilitary groups that would take part in the later violence of the Troubles were formed during the 1960s, and that's despite an earlier non-violent civil rights campaign. Now, issues causing unrest in the Ireland of Heaney's young adulthood included things like discrimination in employment and in housing allocation as well, against the minority Catholic population in the north, who were, of course, the majority population in the south of Ireland, which was the Republic of Ireland. There were also widespread accusations of brutality against the police force. And police in Northern Ireland at the time, they had the right to search without a warrant, to arrest and imprison people without a charge or trial. Now, Ireland was a divided country throughout Heaney's life, often seemingly at war, not simply with those perceived as outsiders, but also with itself. And Heaney, throughout his life, defined himself as Irish. He was never viewed as British or as anything other than Irish. Now, 1966 saw parades held throughout Ireland to mark the 50th anniversary of the Easter Rising, though these also led to widespread destruction and unrest, including bombings and fire attacks by both sides in this escalating conflict. Now, those attacks would ultimately give rise to the Troubles of the 1960s and 1970s. Now, considering Heaney's focus in his writing on the people and environment of his native Ireland, it's perhaps no surprise that he should choose to publish the collection in which this poem appeared, and the collection was called Death of a Naturalist. And it's a collection all about the loss of innocence and naivety in the transition between childhood and adulthood. And he published this so close to the 50th anniversary of this event that was so influential in both the formation and the division of the island that Heaney knew and loved, and in which he had grown up. Now, in simple terms, the poem describes the experience of a group of islanders in a storm, or in storms in general. In the poem, Heaney focuses on the people, on their community, and their relationship with the environment in which they find themselves situated. Now, the poem consists of this single stanza of 19 lines, and it's written in blank verse. Now, essentially what that means is that there is no rhyme scheme, although there is a relatively consistent syllabic count of about 10 syllables in each line. That is disrupted a bit by the longer 17th line, which is, and strafes invisibly, space is a salvo. Now, for those of you who are into your poetry, although much of the poem is iambic, if you think back to your Shakespeare, because English speech generally is mostly iambic, but there are many lines that aren't, and what they do is they make it seem more natural, more conversational. Now, the verse form, along with the widespread use of enjambment and these occasional caesuras in the poem, give it an easy, relatively intimate, personal, and unforced style, with a sense of a personal relationship between the speaker and the audience, which is reinforced by the pronouns shifting between this collective experience of we and our, as in we are prepared, we build our houses, and the apparently autobiographical and dialogic I and you in As You Can See, You Know What I Mean. Interjections such as "you know what I mean" and "as you can see" add to this kind of sense of a conversational, personal tone, as does the use of the present tense throughout. And that creates this feeling of immediacy and relevance. Events in the poem feel like they're happening now. Now, the title appears straightforward. The poem is about literally a storm on an island. And the title tells us that it's about exactly that, a storm on an island. It's worth unpicking the phrasing slightly. Now, the lack of an article such as a or the before storm suggests that this poem isn't necessarily about a single storm. It's about storms in a more general sense, experiences that seem all too familiar for the narrative voice. But equally, the lack of a or the before storm could lead us to conclude that we should understand storm metaphorically, perhaps even that the poem is about social unrest. I mean, storm, after all, is not just a noun, but a verb. And it's not hard to see Heaney's integration of Stormont, which is the seat of government within Northern Ireland, within that title. Now, do remember also that Ireland, for the majority of English speakers, would be almost a homophone for Ireland, the country, suggesting that it may be possible to link the storm on the island to conflict in Ireland. Now, the storm in the poem, whether it's metaphorical or literal, is very much a group experience. Actions in preparing for the storm and the enduring of it, they're both described collectively, which is made clear through the pronoun choices. We are prepared. We build our houses. Never troubled us. We just sit tight. We are bombarded. We fear. Now, the suggestion seems to be that in the same way that the island is this enclosed space, in contrast to the wider world that surrounds it, the homes in which the islanders live are also self-enclosed spaces that are more cohesive and more collective because of the external pressure of the storm. In a sense, the existence of the other of the storm creates a more unified sense of who we are. Or phrased more simply, all the bad stuff outside forces the people inside closer together. Now, this is linked to the sense of confidence and positivity in the first part of the poem. We are prepared, the speaker asserts confidently, thanks to the building of the squat houses, sinking walls in rock and roofing them with good slate. And hard work though this may be, there's a sense of pride, of care in the work. And actions are more constructive than giving in to fear, the poem seems to suggest. The houses are squat for practical purposes. They're better able to withstand these storms that batter the island. They may not be tall and grand, but those which are lower and more stable are more likely to survive, which is perhaps a lot like the inhabitants. In fact, rather than fear of the destructive capacity of the storm, the speaker seems, at least initially, to focus on positive aspects. So rather than bemoaning the lack of the hay with which the wizened earth had never troubled us, the speaker celebrates the fact that there are no stacks or stooks that can be lost. Though this may be intended as a piece of bitter irony, in the sense of nature attacking them now, but also being against them in a wider sense. There are no stacks, nor are there trees, and the earth has never troubled them with this vital crop. Throughout the poem, the answer to every problem seems to be rooted in the earth. The squat houses are sunk in rock, while good slate provides the roof. Humankind, in order to survive their natural environment, they must utilise that environment, work with it, learn from it, and gain stability and protection from it. That said, nature can't ever be taken for granted. Just when nature seems under control, when we think that the sea is company, a tame cat, it will have turned savage, acting in opposition to us through the semantic field of human conflict, exploding, dives, strafes, salvo, bombarded. In a sense, this is an ironic inversion. Humanity may feel confident that it's mastered nature, may feel most confident when it has used nature. We are prepared, the speaker asserted, remember. But the storm makes a nonsense of this, attacking us in the style of human warfare. Now, perhaps partially that's the point of the poem. It's the broader challenges of nature that matter rather more than these petty conflicts of people over a landscape which isn't ours to control. That really we should be working together to overcome these challenges, to endure, rather than fighting amongst ourselves. And in terms of fighting in that wider semantic field of warfare, remember that in terms of the Troubles and the way that the conflict is described, it's often referred to as being a war from an Irish perspective. After all, groups like the IRA, this is the Irish Republican Army. They see it as a military conflict in which they're taking part. Now, Heaney's use of enjambment and sound are important in understanding his depiction of the weather. The first few lines, which focus on the stability of the houses that they've built, are end-stopped. When Heaney turns to describing the earth and then the weather, the lines become more free-flowing. And that reflects the topic, I think. These small, stable things are presented in small, stable sentences, and bigger, free-flowing things are presented in longer, more free-flowing sentences, with the longest and these least interrupted sentences running from "nor are there trees" and from "you might think." Now, these both represent the continuous blowing of the wind and the attack of the storm, though the wind image is smoother and less fragmented than the later aggression of the sea, where these smaller phrases are used to create a more negative and divided feeling. Now, this depiction of the weather is also reflected in Heaney's use of sound in the poem. Now, Heaney uses a high proportion of these monosyllabic words, these single-syllable words: sink walls in rock and roof them with good slate. And he frequently turns to these aggressive, plosive sounds to present the unforgiving environment, and alliterating them to reinforce that feeling. Sink and rock, stacks and stucks, blows and blast. And you can just hear those aggressive sounds coming through there. But sibilance and alliteration, I think, are also used to reinforce the flow of the poem, to give the whole thing cohesion. The sibilance of houses and squat in the first line continues with the sink and walls in the second. Stacks in the fourth line alliterates with stucks in the fifth line. Blows in the sixth line alliterates with blast in the seventh. Hits in the 14th line is linked by an internal rhyme to spits in the 15th, while the T sounds on spit and tame and cat then also link us to turned in the 16th. Sibilance is often associated, I think, with weather such as rain and wind, because it sounds smooth, continuous, and fairly sinister, maybe. While that harsh, alliterated plosive sound reminds us of the aggression of the storm in the background. In an odd sort of way, I think Heaney is depicting the stormy island not simply as a landscape, but arguably as a soundscape, which would link very neatly with Wilfred Owen's work. Now, the landscape itself is bare and barren, wizened, Heaney describes it as being, and full, as far as we can tell, of rock and slate. The earth, personified, is infertile. The earth has never troubled us with hay, and nor are there trees, no natural shelters, nothing to build with, nothing to eat, not even leaves and branches to prove company, or to raise a tragic chorus in a gale. In this sense, the only thing able to stand up to the might of nature is the human construction, the house. And the sea, similarly to the earth, while it may seem like company, friendly, inviting, is actually savage, something that hits and spits. The inhabitants are similarly powerless when they're confronted by the wind. It comes from nowhere, attacking from the empty air and strafing invisibly. This destructive and invisible force beyond the understanding of humankind, against which we can only sit tight. However, the sense of fear is emphasised by the lack of specificity. We are listening to the thing you fear, Heaney writes, deliberately avoiding pinning down precisely what that thing is, until confessing in the final line that it's nothing. This is empty, strange, yes, and huge, but nothing. A pointless fear, a figment of our imaginations. And Heaney's perhaps suggesting that our fear of nature is irrational, that it's our own perception of nature as dangerous that's causing our fear, or that it is the absence of something that is most fearsome for those on the island. And there is perhaps that link back to this idea of politics, that the wind is just empty air, that all this arguing and this conflict arises out of nothing but noise and fury. But notice, though, that final pronoun choice, however negative nature is in the form of the storm, or this idea of this external pressure would be, whether political or natural, it's still bonding the people. It's still this external force that produces social, interpersonal, and cultural solidarity. So just to close up, maybe a quick summary, a kind of a simplified version. So Heaney was Irish and grew up in the countryside. Ireland had been going through some problems in terms of politics while Heaney was growing up, and the title contains Stormont, which is the seat of government in Northern Ireland. The poem is about a group of people on an island during the storm. It's a single stanza, mostly 10-syllable lines. It feels conversational. People in the poem are sharing their experiences. They're both building their houses and putting up with the storm. The island's barren and bare, but at least that means there's nothing to get blown away. The poem's written like the weather. Heaney uses sounds, line lengths and breaks in the lines to make it all feel and sound like a storm. And essentially what the poem is addressing is this idea of people being powerless against the storm, but becoming powerful by being collective, by being grouped together. And there's essentially nothing to be done but putting up with it, enduring it, being strong enough to accept it, and surviving it at the end. Okay, and thank you very much for listening. As ever, if you have any questions, please do feel free to ask your teachers or any of the English directors in NET.